The moment the cameras went live, the tension in the air was unmistakable. The setting was polished, the backdrop sleek and professional, but beneath the surface, there was an undeniable current of anticipation. This was more than just another televised debate. This was a moment that had been carefully orchestrated, a situation designed to put her in a corner. The intention was clear. This was a game, and the rules had already been set. From the moment she took her seat, there was an air of confidence about her that was impossible to ignore. She didn't fidget. She didn't adjust herself nervously. She sat with the kind of poise that only comes from someone who knows exactly what they stand for. The way she held herself, the way she made eye contact with the cameras. It was the posture of someone who had walked into many rooms like this before and walked out completely unscathed. The words thrown her way were carefully chosen. The phrasing was deliberate, every question framed to push her into a corner. There was an expectation, a silent one, but an expectation nonetheless, that she would falter, that she would stumble under the weight of the moment. But instead of shrinking back, she listened. She listened not with apprehension, but with a patience that suggested she had already anticipated this. It was almost as if she had predicted every single word that was being said. Her eyes didn't waver. She didn't shift uncomfortably in her seat, nor did she look to the side as if searching for the right words. She allowed the question to hang in the air for just a moment, long enough for everyone watching to take in the weight of it. And then, with a calm that was almost unnerving, she began to speak. Her words weren't rushed. They weren't spoken in a way that suggested defensiveness or panic. Instead, they were steady, deliberate, and precise. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Each statement was carefully crafted, designed not just to respond, but to turn the entire conversation on its head. And that's when it happened. That's when the realization started to creep in, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. This wasn't going the way it was supposed to. The attempt to pressure her into an uncomfortable position wasn't working. Instead, she was the one, in control. The balance of power had shifted, and it had happened so quickly, so effortlessly, that it was almost imperceptible at first. The frustration was evident, not in words, but in body language. The slight stiffening of posture, the quick blinking, the barely concealed effort to maintain composure. It was clear that the initial strategy was failing. The expectation had been that she would be overwhelmed, that she would struggle to counter the carefully structured arguments laid before her. But instead, she was dismantling them with ease, not through aggression, but through sheer confidence and unshakable conviction. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to resort to theatrics. All she needed were facts, clarity, and a refusal to be manipulated. Each counterpoint she made was like a precision strike, hitting exactly where it needed to, and the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she wasn't just holding her own, she was dominating. The attempt to regain control was obvious. The shift in tone, the attempt to interrupt, to redirect, to reframe the conversation, it was all happening in real time. But she was unbothered. She let the interruptions come, let the attempts at deflection play out, and then, with the same unwavering confidence, she steered the conversation right back to where she wanted it. The audience could sense it too. There was a shift in the energy, a shift in the way people were reacting. Those who had initially expected to see her falter were now leaning in, drawn to the sheer strength of her presence. And those who had anticipated an easy takedown were quickly realizing that this was anything but. This wasn't a situation where someone was on the defensive. This wasn't a moment where someone was fighting to keep up. This was something else entirely. This was a masterclass in composure, a demonstration of what it looked like when someone refused to be shaken, no matter how calculated the opposition. It was undeniable. The moment that had been designed to challenge her had backfired spectacularly. What had started as an attempt to corner her had turned into something entirely different. The power dynamics had shifted, and they weren't shifting back. She leaned in slightly, not out of intimidation, but with the kind of certainty that made it clear she was in complete control. The words directed at her had been carefully chosen, meant to disarm, to provoke, to catch her off guard. Yet, instead of reacting with hesitation or uncertainty, she remained composed. She let the question settle in the air for a moment, allowing the weight of it to fully land before responding. Her tone was measured, unwavering, deliberate. There was no scrambling for the right words, no sign of unease. Instead, she began to speak with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore her. The moment she opened her mouth, the entire dynamic of the conversation changed. This was not going to be a simple rebuttal. This was something far more powerful. She started by addressing the premise directly, not shying away from it, but rather exposing its flaws. It was done so effortlessly that it was almost surgical, as though she had anticipated this very moment long before it even happened. With every word, she unraveled the argument before her, breaking it down piece by piece, revealing the inconsistencies in a way that made them impossible to ignore. The attempt to interject was expected, but she didn't waver. She continued speaking, refusing to let herself be silenced or derailed. There was a quiet force behind her words, something far more powerful than volume or aggression. It was the kind of confidence that didn't need to be shouted to be felt. Each statement she made was precise, carefully constructed to leave no room for misinterpretation. She wasn't merely countering what had been said, she was turning it inside out, exposing the hypocrisy with undeniable clarity. There was no need for dramatics. The truth alone was powerful enough. The reaction was immediate, a subtle but unmistakable shift in energy. The balance of control had changed. It was evident in the way people leaned in, drawn to the sheer command she had over the conversation. It was in the growing silence, the realization that she wasn't just holding her own. She was dominating. What had begun as an attempt to push her into a corner had now turned into something entirely different. She wasn't merely defending herself, she was setting the terms of the discussion. She was no longer responding to accusations, she was challenging them outright, forcing a reckoning that had not been planned for. And then, with one final statement, she drove her point home. It wasn't just a response, it was an undeniable truth, one that left no room for debate. There was nothing left to counter, no loophole to escape through. The moment was undeniable. The silence that followed said everything. The tension in the room had shifted. What had started as a controlled exchange had now spiraled into something no one had anticipated. The air was thick with an unspoken realization, a silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had changed. The audience, once passively observing, was now fully engaged. Some sat forward in their seats, while others exchanged glances as if confirming to themselves that they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold in real time. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to signal that something had shifted. People weren't just watching anymore, they were reacting. Every carefully planned question, every calculated move that had been meant to steer the conversation in a particular direction had been effortlessly unraveled. And now, as the dust settled, there was no doubt left about who was in control. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The strength of her words was enough to make people listen. She had methodically dismantled every argument thrown, her way, leaving no room for doubt, no space for misinterpretation. And as the weight of her words settled over the room, the response was immediate. A few scattered claps broke the silence at first, hesitant but undeniable. Then more followed. The reaction wasn't just polite acknowledgement, it was something deeper. It was the kind of applause that came from people who had just witnessed something powerful, something that resonated beyond the conversation itself. It wasn't just about what had been said, it was about how it had been said, how effortlessly she had stood her ground and turned the entire exchange in her favor. The contrast in reactions was striking. Some in the audience sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Others nodded in approval, murmuring among themselves as if replaying the moment in their minds. But the most telling reaction came from those who had expected a different outcome. The ones who had assumed this would be an easy takedown, who had believed that the conversation had already been decided before it even began. They were the ones Now shifting uncomfortably, their carefully rehearsed certainty now replaced with something else, something that looked a lot like doubt. She remained calm, her expression unreadable, as if this entire moment had played out exactly as she had expected. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The reaction from the audience spoke for itself. This wasn't just about proving a point, it was about exposing a deeper truth, one that had been ignored for far too long. More murmurs swept through the room, growing louder now. Some people were still attempting to process what had just happened, while others had already reached their conclusion. The energy in the room had changed entirely. The conversation had begun with a certain expectation, a predetermined outcome that had seemed inevitable. And yet, here they were, watching as that expectation was completely shattered before their eyes. She remained composed, unwavering, as the realization settled over everyone in the room. The moment was hers. The moment hung heavy in the air, stretching far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The shift had already happened, but now it was reaching its breaking point. The conversation was no longer in the hands of those who had planned it. Control had slipped away, piece by piece, until there was only one person left standing in complete command. She sat still, unbothered by the growing tension. Where others might have fidgeted or searched for the right words, she remained firm, her confidence radiating in every movement. She had already dismantled the weak arguments thrown her way, had already unraveled the contradictions and hypocrisy with effortless precision. Now there was only one thing left to do. She didn't rush. She let the silence settle, stretching out just long enough for the weight of the moment to sink in. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her, waiting, anticipating what would come next. And then, when the timing was just right, she spoke. Her words were deliberate, sharp, cutting through the false narratives like a blade. It wasn't just about disproving the arguments that had been thrown at her, it was about exposing the deeper truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. She wasn't just countering claims, she was dismantling an entire mindset, breaking apart the carefully built illusion that had been maintained for so long. The reaction was instant. The air in the room shifted, thick with a mixture of disbelief, shock, and something else. Something resembling respect. Even those who had been waiting for her to stumble, who had wanted to see her fail, now sat in stunned silence. The power dynamic had completely flipped, and there was no way to deny it. The attempt to redirect, to regain control, was weak. Too weak. The confidence that had once filled the room was gone now, replaced by a desperation that was impossible to ignore. She didn't need to acknowledge it. She didn't need to react to the growing discomfort. She had already won, and she knew it. The moment of realization spread across the faces in the audience, each person coming to terms with the fact that they had just witnessed something they could never unsee. The old tactics no longer worked. The usual methods of control had failed. The carefully rehearsed script had been torn apart, leaving nothing but the raw truth exposed for all to see. The silence that followed was more powerful than any words that could have been spoken. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of undeniable truth, hanging heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. The silence in the room wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a declaration. It was the kind of silence that followed a seismic shift, the kind that settled over a space when something undeniable had just taken place. Every argument, every attempt to steer the conversation had crumbled under the weight of truth. And now, there was nothing left to say. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or revel in what had just happened. She simply sat there, poised and composed, letting the moment speak for itself. That was the most powerful part of it all. She didn't need to say anything else. The truth had already landed, and everyone in the room felt its impact. There was a visible discomfort from those who had expected a different outcome. The ones who had assumed they were in control now sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact, their carefully constructed confidence shattered. They had underestimated her, expected her to back down, to stumble, to falter. But instead, she had turned their own platform against them, using nothing but conviction, facts, and an unshakable belief in what was right. The audience had seen it all unfold. They had watched as the conversation shifted, as she took command, without ever raising her voice, without ever resorting to cheap tactics. The respect in the room was no longer just from those who had supported her from the start. It was from those who had doubted her, from those who now saw what they could no longer ignore. As she leaned back slightly, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. The attempt to control the narrative had failed spectacularly, and there was no undoing what had just happened. No quick save, no last-minute rebuttal could erase the truth that had been spoken. The cameras were still rolling, the audience still watching, but the conversation was over. It wasn't because she had ended it forcefully, it was because there was nowhere left for it to go. There were no more illusions to maintain, no more false premises to cling to. She had walked into this moment fully aware of what it was supposed to be, a staged confrontation meant to put her on the defensive. But instead, she had rewritten the script entirely. Not through aggression, not through theatrics, but through the sheer power of standing firm. And that was the part that would linger the longest. Not just in that room, but beyond it. The realization that the usual tactics no longer worked. That the carefully constructed narratives couldn't hold up against someone who refused to be intimidated. That the power of truth, spoken with unwavering conviction, was stronger than any attempt to silence it. With one final glance around the room, she let the silence linger just a moment longer. Then, with the same quiet confidence she had carried throughout the entire exchange, she stood, turned, and walked away, leaving behind a moment no